Emily had always believed that some things in life were set in stone. One of them was that the family estate, the house her mother had loved and nurtured for decades, would one day be hers. It wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary, a place of memories carved into every wooden beam, every patch of the sprawling garden. It was where she took her first steps, where she spent countless afternoons curled up with books by the bay window, where her mother had planted rose bushes that still bloomed every spring. It was home, and it was supposed to be hers. She had spent her entire life being the responsible one. Unlike her younger brother Jacob, who had always been the family's golden child, Emily had never asked for much. She had worked hard, built a career in real estate, and prided herself on never needing a safety net. While Jacob drifted through life, dropping out of college, bouncing from one failed business idea to another, and constantly borrowing money from their father, Emily had been the one to keep things steady. Their father, Robert, had always been indulgent with Jacob's mistakes, dismissing his failures as learning experiences while holding Emily to a far stricter standard. For years, she had accepted this imbalance, convincing herself that it wasn't worth the fight. She told herself it didn't matter that their father had covered Jacob's debts more times than she could count, while never offering Emily a dime. She ignored the way their father always seemed to light up when Jacob entered the room, how he boasted about his son's entrepreneurial spirit, even when Jacob's ventures crashed and burned. She had told herself that none of it mattered because, at the end of the day, she had her independence, and she had the one thing Jacob would never have: self-respect. But standing in her father's study that afternoon, watching him shuffle uncomfortably behind his desk, she realized how naive she had been. "Emily, sweetheart," Robert began, his voice calm, as if he were delivering some routine piece of news. "I know you've always loved the house and your mother wanted you to have it. But circumstances have changed." The weight in her chest began to spread, her fingers tightening around the armrest of the chair she was sitting in. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her voice even. "What do you mean, changed?" Her father sighed, as if she was being unreasonable. "Jacob needed some help. He's finally found something he's passionate about, a new business opportunity. He came to me with a plan, and I thought it was only right that I support him." Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She could already see where this was going. "What did you do?" Robert hesitated for only a moment before exhaling heavily. "I sold the house to help him get started." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. For a second, she couldn't even breathe. Sold. He had sold it. Their family home. Her inheritance. Her mother's legacy. "You sold it," she repeated, barely recognizing her own voice. Robert nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Yes, but you have to understand, sweetheart, it was the right thing to do. Jacob has always struggled and he needed a chance. He needed a fresh start." Emily let out a short, humorless laugh, her shock quickly hardening into something sharper, colder. "So you sold Mom's house to fund another one of Jacob's failures? And you didn't even think to tell me?" "Don't be dramatic," Robert chided. "You're doing well for yourself. You don't need the house. Jacob does. This is about family, about supporting each other." Emily felt her hands tremble, not with fear but with rage. "Supporting each other," she repeated. Funny how that only ever applies when Jacob is the one who needs something. Her father's expression darkened slightly. "That's not fair. You've always been independent, Emily. You don't rely on me the way Jacob does." "Because I never had a choice," she snapped, unable to keep the bitterness out of her voice. "Because I knew you'd never be there for me the way you are for him." Robert sighed again, looking at her with the same patient disappointment he always had when she didn't fall in line. "I thought you'd understand," he said quietly. "I thought you'd see the bigger picture." Emily stared at him, at the man who had raised her, the man she had spent her whole life trying to make proud. And for the first time she saw him for what he really was: not a misguided father trying to do his best, but a man who had made his choice, and it wasn't her. She stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You thought wrong." As she turned to leave, she heard her father call her name, but she didn't stop. She didn't look back. The man behind her was no longer her father. And from that moment on, she was no longer his daughter. Emily drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, illuminating the thoughts racing through her mind. She replayed the conversation with her father over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. "I thought you'd understand." The sheer arrogance of it made her stomach churn. He had made a decision that shattered everything she had believed about their family, and he had expected her to simply accept it, to nod and smile like she always did, like she had been trained to do since childhood. Her mother would have never allowed this. The house had been a piece of her soul, a part of the love and care she had poured into their family. Emily could still remember the way her mother had run her fingers over the polished oak banisters, humming softly as she arranged fresh flowers in the antique vases lining the hallways. The house had smelled like lavender and lemon, always clean, always warm, always full of love. And now it was gone. Sold. Reduced to nothing more than a financial transaction to bail out Jacob again. As Emily pulled into her driveway, she barely noticed how numb her body felt. She slammed the car door behind her, storming inside, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent years pretending that she wasn't affected by her father's favoritism, that she didn't care when Jacob was given second, third, fourth chances, while she was expected to stand on her own. But tonight had proven what she had feared all along: she had never mattered. Not the way Jacob did. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She ignored it at first, but when it rang again, she grabbed it and glanced at the screen. Jacob. The sight of his name made something snap inside her. She pressed accept without thinking, her voice ice cold. "You've got some nerve calling me right now," she said before he could speak. Whoa, Jacob chuckled, his tone light as if none of this mattered. "Relax, Em. I just wanted to talk." Emily's grip on the phone tightened. "Talk? You want to talk now? After you stole my inheritance and let Dad do your dirty work?" Stole, Jacob scoffed. "Come on, don't be dramatic. It's not like you needed that house. You've got your own place, your own life. Why are you making this such a big deal?" Emily let out a breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Because it wasn't yours to take, Jacob. That house was supposed to be mine. Mom wanted me to have it." Jacob sighed, the way he always did when he thought she was being unreasonable. "Look, I get that you're upset, but this is about more than just a house. This is about family. Dad saw that I needed help, and he did what any good father would do." A hollow laugh escaped her lips. "A good father? A good father wouldn't betray his daughter like this. A good father wouldn't take something that was rightfully mine and hand it to the one child who never earned a damn thing in his life." Jacob's tone shifted, growing defensive. "You don't get it, Em. You've always had your shit together. You're successful, independent. Meanwhile, I've been struggling to find my place. Dad saw that, and he gave me a chance. Why is that so hard for you to accept?" Emily closed her eyes, willing herself not to explode. "Because it's not about needing help, Jacob. It's about the fact that you expect it. You never take responsibility for anything because you know Dad will always clean up your mess. And this time, he used my future to do it." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then Jacob sighed again. But there was something else in his voice, this time something almost smug. "Look, it's done. The deal is finalized. There's no going back. So you can either keep being bitter about it, or you can move on. Your choice." Emily stared at the floor, her jaw clenching. No going back. That was what he thought. That she would roll over, just like she always had. That she would swallow her pride and walk away because it was easier than fighting. But Jacob didn't know what she was capable of when she had nothing left to lose. Her voice was calm, steady, lethal. "You really think this is over?" Jacob hesitated. She ended the call. For the first time in her life, she wasn't going to be the bigger person. She wasn't going to be the one who backed down. If her father and Jacob thought they could strip her of what was rightfully hers without consequences, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Emily placed her phone on the counter, exhaling slowly as a new, sharper clarity settled over her. There was always a way to take back what was stolen. She just had to find it. And when she did, neither Jacob nor her father would ever see it coming. Emily spent the next 2 days in a state of quiet calculation. She didn't lash out. She didn't call her father again or demand explanations that would never satisfy her. She didn't waste her breath arguing with Jacob, who had made it painfully clear he saw nothing wrong with taking what wasn't his. No, she did what she had always done. She planned. While her father and brother basked in their victory, confident she would sulk in silence before eventually letting it go, Emily was doing something neither of them had ever expected. She was preparing to strike back. The first step was simple. She needed to find out everything about the sale. Sitting in her home office, she pulled up the county records and began searching. It didn't take long before she found the details. The buyer was listed as a private investment group, but Emily recognized the name attached to the transaction: James Calloway, one of Jacob's so-called business partners. It made sense. Their father had never wanted to sell the house to an outsider. That would have been an actual loss. No, this was something else. This was a scheme. Her father had sold the house to someone connected to Jacob so that it could be funneled right back into his hands under the guise of a legitimate deal. That way, when Jacob's latest business venture inevitably failed, the house would remain in the family, waiting to be reclaimed. A safety net, just like always. Emily leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. She had spent her entire life believing that if she worked hard enough, if she proved herself over and over, she would be treated fairly. But this was proof that nothing she did would ever be enough for them. They had made their choice. Now, she would make hers. The next morning, Emily scheduled a meeting with her lawyer. She walked into the office dressed in black, her heels clicking against the polished floors with sharp precision. She had always liked Olivia Sanders, a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s with the kind of legal mind that could tear through a contract like a scalpel through flesh. If anyone could find a way to reverse this mess, it was her. After Emily explained everything, Olivia tapped a pen against her desk, her sharp eyes scanning the documents Emily had gathered. "It's not an impossible case," she said finally. "But it's tricky. Since the sale is already finalized, we'd need to prove fraud or misrepresentation. If we can show that your father acted in bad faith selling the house under false pretenses with the intent of diverting assets, then we have a real shot at undoing it." Emily exhaled. "And how do we do that?" Olivia smiled. "We dig. We find discrepancies in the financials, inconsistencies in the deal. We follow the money. If your brother and his so-called business partner pulled any shady strings, we'll find them." Emily nodded. "Do whatever it takes." Olivia studied her for a moment before leaning forward. "This won't be a quick fight, Emily. And it won't be clean. You're going up against your own family. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Emily met her gaze, her voice steady. "They stopped being my family the moment they stole from me." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Olivia and her team started digging, pulling financial records, tracking communications between Jacob, their father, and Calloway. Emily, in the meantime, played the game just as ruthlessly. She kept her silence, didn't let on that she was moving against them. She answered her father's occasional calls with the same measured tone as always. When Jacob texted her, smug and self-assured, she responded with polite indifference. Let them think she was backing down. Let them think they had won. It would make their downfall all the more satisfying. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear. One evening, Olivia called with news. "We found something interesting," she said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Calloway took out a private loan 2 weeks before the sale. A very large one. And guess who the co-signer was?" Emily didn't even have to guess. Jacob. Bingo. That means the sale wasn't really a sale. It was a shell transaction. Calloway never actually had the money to buy the house. He just borrowed it, using your father's signature as leverage. And once Jacob's business deal went through, the house would have quietly shifted into his name, erasing any paper trail that led back to your father. Emily felt a sharp, cold thrill of vindication. So we can prove it was fraudulent. We can argue it. Absolutely. It's enough to file a motion to block any further transfers of the property. If we move quickly, we can freeze the sale before Jacob can do anything with it. Emily exhaled, closing her eyes for a brief moment. Do it. By the time her father and Jacob realized what was happening, it was too late. The court had already placed a hold on the property, preventing any further transactions. The sale was now under legal scrutiny, and Jacob's business deal, the one he had counted on so desperately, was suddenly in jeopardy. The first call came from her father. His voice was tight with frustration, but there was something else there, too, fear. Emily, he said, trying to keep his tone level. We need to talk about what you've done. She smiled, a slow, deliberate thing. What I've done, she echoed. You mean how I stopped you from laundering my inheritance into Jacob's pockets? You don't understand, he snapped. This isn't just about you. No, she agreed. It never was. It was about Jacob. It was always about him. But you forgot something, Dad. Silence stretched on the line. Then, finally, he asked, and what's that? Emily leaned back in her chair, her voice like steel. I don't lose. And for the first time in his life, Robert had no response. Emily sat in her office, the golden light of late afternoon spilling through the blinds, painting stripes of shadow across her desk. Her phone sat silent beside her, but she knew it wouldn't last. Her father was scrambling. Jacob was panicking. The cracks were widening, and soon, the entire foundation of their scheme would collapse beneath them. She had spent years being the afterthought, the dependable one who never made trouble. But this time, she wasn't just fighting back, she was tearing their world apart piece by piece. The first call came from Jacob. Predictable. His voice, usually dripping with smug confidence, was laced with frustration and barely restrained anger. What the hell do you think you're doing? He snapped the second she answered. Emily took her time, adjusting the papers in front of her, making him wait. I don't know, Jacob. What do you think I'm doing? You filed an injunction on the house, he shouted. Do you even realize what you've done? My deal is on the line because of you. A small, satisfied smile tugged at her lips. You mean the deal where you and Calloway used a fraudulent loan to move assets under Dad's nose? Yeah, I realize what I've done. Jacob cursed under his breath, his voice dropping to a desperate growl. Emily, listen to me. You don't have to do this. This isn't just about me, this is about family. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, letting the words settle. And then she let out a slow, mirthless laugh. Family, she repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time. You mean the same family that stole from me? The same family that never once thought to ask if I'd be okay with this. The same family that expected me to just smile and accept it. Jacob fell silent, and for the first time, she heard something unfamiliar in his voice, uncertainty. You don't understand how business works, he said. But there was no real fight behind it now, just an exhausted attempt at control. Sometimes you have to move things around, make sacrifices. Emily's fingers drummed against the desk. And it's funny, isn't it, she mused, how every time there's a sacrifice to be made, it's always me who's losing something. Tell me, Jacob, what have you ever sacrificed? Another long silence. This time, he had no answer. The next call was from her father. She almost didn't pick up, but something inside her told her to listen. Emily, Robert said, his voice calmer than Jacob's but carrying the same undercurrent of desperation. We need to talk. She leaned back in her chair. I'm listening. You went too far with this legal action, he continued. You're hurting Jacob more than you realize. Her jaw clenched. I don't care, she said simply. I don't care what happens to Jacob. I care about what's mine. Her father sighed, as if she were being difficult. I don't think you understand the full picture. Your brother has invested everything into this business. If this deal doesn't go through, he loses everything. Emily let the words sit between them, turning them over, waiting for the weight of them to land. But they didn't. Instead, something cold and sharp settled inside her, a realization that sent a slow burn of satisfaction through her veins. "Good," she said finally. Robert was silent for so long she thought he might have hung up. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You don't mean that." She did. She meant every single word. "Dad," she said, her voice steady, unyielding. "Jacob was never supposed to have that house. You and I both know it. You sold off Mom's legacy to save him from himself, just like you always do. And for the first time, it's not working. You're being cruel." Emily exhaled, shaking her head. "No, you were cruel when you handed over something that was never yours to give away. I'm just giving you a reminder that actions have consequences." Her father let out a slow breath. "Is this what you want, Emily? To tear this family apart?" She laughed, the sound bitter and cold. "You think I'm the one who did that?" He tried again, softer this time, as if coaxing a child. "If we fix this, if we undo the deal, will that be enough for you?" A dangerous silence settled between them. A month ago, a week ago, she might have considered it. She might have seen this as a victory. But now she understood something much more important. This was never just about the house. This was about them, their choices, their betrayals. The years she had spent watching them favor Jacob while she worked twice as hard for half the recognition. This was about every sacrifice she had made, every moment she had been dismissed, every time they had looked at her and seen nothing but someone to use. "You don't get to decide what's enough for me," she said finally. "Not anymore." She hung up before he could respond. By the end of the week, the walls had started closing in on Jacob. The loan Calloway had taken out was now under scrutiny, their business deal unraveling. Suppliers began pulling out, hesitant to associate with a company now facing potential legal action. And Emily? She barely had to lift a finger. The damage was happening on its own. She was at home, sipping a glass of wine, when another text came through. From Jacob, "Meet me. We need to talk." She stared at the message, debating whether to ignore it, whether to let him sweat a little longer. But something told her that this was the moment. This was when the game changed. She typed back 2 words, "Fine." An hour later, she arrived at a dimly lit bar on the edge of town. Jacob was already there, nursing a drink, his posture tense. When she slid into the seat across from him, he looked up, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, he didn't look like he had all the answers. He looked cornered. "You win," he said, his voice hollow. She tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "Do I?" He let out a bitter laugh. "You think I don't know what you're doing? You could have just stopped at blocking the sale. But you didn't. You let it all fall apart. My business, my reputation. You wanted to ruin me." Emily took a slow sip of her wine. "I didn't have to ruin you, Jacob. You did that all on your own." He clenched his jaw. But he didn't argue. Because he knew it was true. "Are you happy now?" he muttered. Emily set her glass down, meeting his gaze. "I'm getting there." And as she stood, leaving him alone with the weight of his failures, she knew the best was yet to come. Jacob's world was falling apart faster than he could keep up. Emily watched it happen with the kind of satisfaction she had never imagined she'd feel, yet here she was, standing at the edge of the wreckage he had created, watching as he scrambled to hold it all together. But there was no saving him now. The day after their meeting, the real fallout began. The court ruling had not only put a hold on the house transfer, but it had also triggered a deeper investigation into Calloway's finances. The bank grew suspicious of the rushed loan and began looking into its legitimacy. Within 48 hours, Calloway's accounts were frozen, halting all financial transactions related to Jacob's so-called business venture. Suppliers backed out, clients withdrew their interest, and suddenly Jacob was left with nothing but debt and a mountain of failed promises. Emily had expected him to fight, to scramble, to try and twist the situation in his favor. But what she hadn't expected was the call from their father. "Emily, you have to stop this." Robert's voice was tight, his usual commanding tone edged with something else: fear. "Jacob is in real trouble. He could lose everything." She was sitting on her back porch, the evening breeze cool against her skin, a glass of wine resting on the table beside her. She didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch long enough for him to feel it. Then, calmly, she asked, "And why is that my problem?" Robert let out a sharp breath. "Because he's your brother." "No," she said, swirling her wine slowly. "He was my brother. Before he stole from me. Before you decided that his future was more important than mine. Before you expected me to accept it like I always have. But things have changed, Dad. I've changed." "You don't understand," Robert pushed. "If this doesn't get sorted out, Jacob could be facing fraud charges. His entire future is at stake. And you're just going to let that happen." She laughed, short and humorless. "You want to talk about futures, Dad? Mine didn't seem to matter when you were signing that deal, did it?" Robert was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think it would come to this." "No," Emily said coldly. "You just thought I'd take it. Like I always have. Like Mom always did." His sharp inhale told her she had hit a nerve. "Emily, please," Robert said, and for the first time she heard something close to desperation in his voice. "You've made your point. Jacob's learned his lesson. If we can fix this, if we can find a way to make things right, would you be willing to let it go?" A slow smirk curled on her lips. "Make things right," she echoed. "That depends. Do you mean giving me back what's mine? Or do you mean finding a way to protect Jacob again?" "You don't have to do this," Robert said, his voice firmer now, trying to regain control. "We're still a family." Emily exhaled, setting down her wine glass. "No, Dad, we're not. Not anymore." She hung up. The next few days were a storm of consequences. Jacob's name was dragged through financial investigations. Calloway completely cut ties with him to save himself, and their father, once the untouchable, respected businessman, was now associated with a scandal that made people question just how ethical he truly was. And through it all, Emily didn't lift a finger. Because justice wasn't always about action. Sometimes it was about watching people fall from the heights they had built on stolen foundations. The final collapse came faster than Emily had anticipated. She had expected Jacob to put up more of a fight, for their father to scramble harder to protect him. But when the walls truly closed in, when the weight of their actions came crashing down, they folded. And Emily? She stood at the center of it all, watching as the empire of lies and favoritism they had built crumbled into nothing. Jacob's business was officially dead. His accounts were frozen, his investors had pulled out, and Calloway had completely abandoned him, leaving him to deal with the fallout alone. The fraud investigation was gaining momentum, and whispers of legal consequences were beginning to spread. Emily had received a call from Olivia that morning, letting her know that Jacob was now in serious financial and legal trouble. He was drowning, and this time there was no father's hand reaching out to save him. Her father had gone silent. No calls, no texts. Emily knew he was too proud to beg, but also too humiliated to face her. He had spent his life believing that he was in control, that his decisions were final. And now, for the first time, he had lost. It wasn't until later that evening that she got the message. "Jacob, we need to talk. Please." She stared at the words for a long moment before replying. "Fine." They met at the house, her house. The one that was finally, legally, undeniably hers again. The legal hold had been finalized, the fraudulent sale undone. The property was back in her name, and there was nothing Jacob or their father could do about it. When she arrived, Jacob was already there, standing on the front porch. He looked nothing like the arrogant, smug brother she had grown up with. He looked defeated. The weight of his choices had finally settled on his shoulders, and for once there was no easy way out. Emily walked up the steps, her heels clicking against the wood. She didn't speak first. She let him feel the silence. Jacob swallowed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I lost everything. Emily tilted her head. Did you? He let out a breath, shaking his head. You really wanted to ruin me, huh? She folded her arms, considering his words. No, you ruined yourself. I just let it happen. Jacob let out a bitter laugh, looking away. You got what you wanted. The house. Your revenge. Congratulations. Emily's expression remained unreadable. This was never about revenge, Jacob. This was about taking back what was mine. You thought you could steal it, just like you've stolen everything else in life. But this time you lost. Jacob met her gaze, and for the first time she saw it understanding. He finally truly understood that she had never been the problem. That he had never deserved the things handed to him. That this time there was no one left to clean up his mess. Emily stepped past him, unlocking the front door and pushing it open. She turned back, looking at him one last time. I hope you figure out who you are without Dad's help, she said. Because you're on your own now. She didn't wait for a reply. She stepped inside, closed the door, and left him standing there in the cold. Emily stood in the foyer of her house, letting the silence settle around her. It felt different now, lighter, freer. For the first time in her life, she wasn't weighed down by the burden of proving herself to a family that had never truly valued her. The house wasn't just bricks and wood, it was a symbol of everything she had fought for. Everything she had reclaimed. Jacob didn't call again. Their father never reached out. She knew they were licking their wounds, struggling to salvage what was left of their broken plans. She imagined her father sitting alone in his office, replaying everything that had happened, realizing that the one child he had always overlooked had finally outplayed him. Jacob, on the other hand, had disappeared from public view. Without his father's money and connections, without investors willing to take another risk on him, he had no safety net. For the first time, he had to survive on his own. And Emily? She thrived. She threw herself into her work, securing the biggest deals of her career. The house became more than just a victory, it became a home. She renovated it the way she had always dreamed, restoring her mother's beloved garden, repainting the walls, filling it with warmth and life. Every decision was hers alone, every choice a reflection of the woman she had become. Months passed. Seasons changed. And one afternoon, as she sat on the back porch sipping coffee, she realized something surprising. She didn't feel anger anymore. She had spent so much of her life fighting to be seen, to be valued. And for what? For the approval of people who had never deserved her loyalty. That battle was over now. She had won not because she had taken revenge, but because she had taken control. Her phone buzzed beside her. A message from Olivia. House transfer is officially finalized. It's yours. No more appeals. No more loopholes. It's done. Emily smiled, setting the phone down. It had always been hers. But now, for the first time, she didn't need anyone else to acknowledge it, because she knew her worth. And that was something no one could ever take from her again.